How's it going, everyone? We are talking about the Eurovision 2025 results and how the judges and the public seem to disagree on pretty much everything. Very, very interesting results this year. So let's get into that. To those unfamiliar with Eurovision, this is a song competition where singers, bands from different countries compete in a series of concerts, and they are given scores by judges and by the public. Okay, so here jury in this chart refers to the judges, public is the public score. And eventually there's a final concert where the finalists compete, they're given their scores, the scores from jury and public are added up, and there's a first place winner. Now, what we see in the results in many, many cases is that where the jury gives a lower score, the public gives a higher score. And where the jury gives a higher score, the public gives a lower score. And some interesting details. So let's get into it. The chart you see in front of you, on the y-axis, we have the jury score, okay, the total score from the juries from all the different countries. And on the x-axis, we have the public score, the total score for the from the public, from different countries from which you can vote. You can actually vote from like a rest of the world category, so you can vote from anywhere. And so, for example, if we have a point here, so for example, this data point here, this is for Austria, and they were the winners. They got number 1. Congratulations to Austria. So the jury scored them at just over 150, just over 250, 258 to be specific, and the public scored them at 178. We add those up, and they ended up with a higher total score than anyone else, so that's how Austria got first place. Now, when we look at this chart, we see that the points actually form certain clusters. And it's interesting that these clusters somewhat correlate with the rankings. So for example, Austria, that data point is here all by itself. Austria, the number 1 winner, is its own cluster. Then the rankings for 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place, which are to Israel, Estonia, and Sweden, they actually form their own cluster right here. Okay, Israel, Estonia, and Sweden. And it's interesting that in that cluster, they actually all go in a row from 2nd place up and to the left to 3rd place and up and to the left to 4th place, Sweden. What we also see is that the 3 points in this cluster have a negative slope. Okay, we're moving down as we move to the right, which means that the higher the public score, the lower the judges score. The higher the judges score, the lower the public score. So we see this trend of disagreement between the public and the judges for this cluster. But not only this cluster. See this large cluster here? That is the countries that ranked after 4th place. Okay? The kind of mid-ranked countries, they all fall into this central cluster right here. And we also see that this cluster has this kind of negative slope. Countries with a higher jury score tend to have a lower public score. And countries with a higher public score tend to have a lower jury score. Again, this trend of disagreement between jury and the public. Now, the lower scored countries, you could argue this is one cluster down here in the bottom left corner, or you could also argue that this is actually 3 clusters. But whichever way you argue it, you do also kind of see that negative slope. Now, for this lowest cluster here, we actually do see audience and jury agreement on which countries scored the lowest. That's interesting. That's the only thing they seem to agree on, is which countries should rank the lowest. Other than that, the jury and the audience disagree on almost everything. But even then, we do see, if we look at this lower cluster, we do see this kind of downward slope. If it wasn't for this one data point here, Armenia, it would be a much more obvious negative slope here, where even for the lowest ranked performances, those judged the best by the jury were judged the worst by the public, and those judged the best by the public were judged the worst by the jury. Even in these little offshoots right here that you could argue should be part of this cluster or maybe not, right? One, you have United Kingdom and Malta. Again, you have that downward slope. And then you have Lithuania and Norway, again, that downward slope. And of course, those two clusters together, especially combined with this lower cluster here, they create this kind of downward slope. So it looks like there's kind of four clusters, one which is Austria by itself, the winner, and then you have these three kind of stripes. One stripe here, Sweden, Estonia, Israel, one big stripe here, which is the mid-ranked countries, and another stripe right here, the lower-ranked countries. And all of these stripes have this downward slope showing disagreement between the jury and the public. Now, this yellow bar here shows the region where data points would fall if the jury and the public were to agree. Okay, so in this yellow region, the score for the jury and the score for the public are approximately the same. And what we see is the lowest ranked countries, they all fall or into that range. Okay, except like UK, Malta, Norway, not really, but these ones in this bottom corner here, they're all in this yellow range. So jury and public agree on where the lowest scores should be. After that, there's pretty much no agreement. Okay, you've got Germany, Finland, Greece, and that's it. Three countries that the public and the jury agree on. Other than that, they don't agree on anything. Okay, that is very interesting. Now, it's actually not surprising that there could be things that the jury and the public would disagree on. For example, the public might be ranking performances based on the overall performance, not just the musicality, but the choreography, the costume design, the lyrics, whereas judges, theoretically, should be more trained to focus more on the musicality and judge more based on the musicality. And it makes sense that there could be some disagreement there. If there are any political or ideological motivations for who to rank where, well, then again, the public might be driven by politics or ideology, which is different than the politics or ideology that affects the judges. For example, Switzerland here is an interesting example because they are the defending champions. They won Eurovision last year in 2024, and the judges ranked them second place after Austria. But the public gave them 0 points. And maybe that comes from a feeling from the public of, well, they won last time, so let's give someone else a shot this time. Okay, so that's pretty interesting, that case of Switzerland here. Now, there is, of course, reason for audience and jury to agree because they are, of course, watching the same performances. And theoretically, if a performance has a very high quality musicality, well, then that should also be a more enjoyable performance, and the audience should rank that higher as well, right? So there's reasons why you'd expect jury and public to agree, and there's reasons you would expect jury and public to disagree. What these results show is that the reasons for them to disagree clearly overpowered the reasons for them to agree. So, for example, maybe these particular performances had a quite significant difference between the musicality of a performance and the visual components or the lyrics, okay, the choreography, the costume design. And this would actually make sense, okay? If a team is focusing more on choreography and costume design, well, then they would be focusing less on musicality. If they're focusing more on musicality, then they'd be focusing less on costume design, choreography, that sort of thing. If you believe that politics or ideology could affect how people vote, well, these results show that there may be a significant difference in terms of the ideology and politics that affect the judges versus the ideology or politics that affect the general public. Either way, the results are quite interesting. I hope you enjoyed that, and until next time.